He wrote the code that kept a billion-dollar company alive. He built the walls that protected every server, every transaction, every secret. And when the system he created became too valuable to share credit for, they took his name off it, handed his work to someone else, and walked him out the door while he was still carrying his daughter's crayon drawing from his desk. He didn't fight. He didn't sue. He went home and made his 5-year-old a grilled cheese sandwich. This is the story of what happened when the empire he built started to collapse. And the only person who could save it was the man they'd already thrown away. If this story hits you, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Follow along to the very end because what happens between Riker Hale and Victoria Sterling is something neither of them ever planned. The morning they fired Riker Hale, it was 23 degrees in Chicago, and the heating system in his department had been broken for 3 days. He knew this because he'd reported it twice, once through the internal facilities portal and once in a direct message to the building operations manager. And both times the ticket had been closed without resolution. Someone had marked the issue addressed without addressing it. That was how things worked at Synthera Technologies. You flagged the problem, someone buried the flag, and then everyone pretended the problem had never existed. Riker had stopped being surprised by this a long time ago. He sat at his desk at 7:52 in the morning wearing a fleece underneath his work shirt, a detail that his colleague Marcus had teased him about twice already this week. His corner of the office, if you could call it a corner, it was more of an alcove created by the arrangement of server racks and a half-wall partition, was quiet in the specific way that comes from years of deliberate invisibility. He had cultivated that invisibility the way a gardener cultivates a hedge, carefully, consistently, without calling attention to the process. On his monitor, 3 separate windows were open, a terminal running a diagnostic sweep of the perimeter authentication layer, a spreadsheet tracking latency anomalies across the Eastern data cluster, and a browser tab with a recipe for chicken and rice soup, because Maisie had been complaining about a sore throat since Tuesday, and he needed to figure out if he had enough stock at home or if he should stop at the grocery before pickup. He was cross-referencing the latency spreadsheet and thinking about chicken stock when Daniel Marsh walked in. Daniel Marsh was the kind of man who took up more space than he needed. He was 47 years old, 6'2", and had the particular energy of someone who had spent decades being told he was the most important person in every room he entered. He was Synthera's Chief Technology Officer, a title he had held for 4 years despite the fact that Riker had met few people less suited for the technical aspects of the role. Daniel was a manager, a politicker, a relationship builder. He spoke fluently in the language of quarterly projections and stakeholder alignment. What he did not speak, what he had never spoken, was the language of actual systems architecture. That had always been Riker's job. Riker just hadn't been permitted to call it that. Hale. Daniel stopped at the edge of the alcove. He didn't come all the way in. He never did. In 4 years of working alongside each other, if you could call it that, Daniel Marsh had perhaps stood inside Riker's workspace a total of 6 times, and 5 of those had been in the first month, before Daniel understood that Riker's work was real and therefore threatening. Riker looked up from his monitor. Morning. HR needs to see you. Daniel's expression was a careful construction of neutrality, which meant something had already been decided. Temer's office. Now, if you can. Riker looked at his screen. The diagnostic sweep was at 63%. He thought about the latency anomalies in the Eastern cluster, which he'd been tracking for 11 days and which he was increasingly convinced represented the early signature of a cascading failure in the distributed load balancing system. The kind of failure that would be minor and correctable now and catastrophic in 6 to 8 weeks if left unaddressed. He'd written it up twice. Both reports had gone to Daniel. Neither had received a response. The diagnostics are going to need someone to check the output, Riker said. Eastern cluster is showing. Someone else can handle it. Daniel's tone made it clear this was not a conversation. It was a choreography, and Riker's part was to stand up and follow. Tamara's waiting. Riker saved the spreadsheet. He closed the terminal. He looked at the recipe tab for a long moment. Thyme, bay leaves, 2 cups of diced carrot. And then he closed that too, though he kept the ingredients in his head because he would need them later, and the grocery closed at 9. He stood up, and that was when he noticed the small terracotta pot on the corner of his desk. The cactus. It was the size of a coffee mug, thorned and improbably healthy, given the amount of light it received in the alcove, and Maisie had given it to him 8 months ago because she'd read somewhere that cacti were good for offices. He'd kept it in a south-facing window on weekends to make sure it got enough sun. The cactus was the only living thing in the room besides himself. He picked it up. He wasn't entirely sure why. Something in Daniel's carefully neutral expression, some note in the phrase "someone else can handle it" that had a distinct quality of finality. "You won't need that," Daniel said. "It's mine," Riker said simply, and carried it out. Tamara Wells had been Synthera's HR director for 6 years, and she was, in Riker's experience, someone who believed in process the way some people believe in weather, as a force that operated independently of any individual preference. She was professional. She had documents prepared. She had a cardboard box on the side table with the contents of Riker's desk already inside it, which meant this had been planned before today, which meant Daniel had been carrying this decision around for a while and choosing his moment. There was a man from legal whose name Riker didn't catch. There was a separation agreement, 12 pages, already printed and tabbed. Synthera is making strategic adjustments to its technical leadership structure, Tamara said. She said it the way people say things they've rehearsed, careful not to let any particular word carry too much weight. Your position is being eliminated. Riker set the cactus on the table. What position? Tamara glanced at the legal man. Senior Systems Analyst. That's not what I do. It's what your employment classification. I know what my classification says. Riker kept his voice level. He'd learned a long time ago that raising his voice in a room like this accomplished nothing except making it easier to dismiss him. I'm asking about the work. The actual work. The authentication architecture. The perimeter security protocol. The distributed systems framework that the entire eastern and northern data cluster runs on. Silence. That work, Riker continued, is mine. I built it from a blank document 3 years ago. I have version histories, timestamp records, the original architecture whiteboard photos from the planning sessions that Daniel wasn't in because Daniel was in Phoenix for a conference. Tamara looked at her documents. Synthera's intellectual property policy states that all work created during employment. I know the policy. He was still calm. His hands, resting on the table, were still. I'm not contesting ownership. I'm establishing record. There's a difference. The legal man shifted in his chair. The separation agreement, Tamara said, pivoting, includes a severance package of 16 weeks, continuation of health benefits through. My daughter has a follow-up appointment with her pediatric allergist in March, Riker said. This was not a negotiation tactic. It was simply the thing that mattered most at that specific moment. I need to confirm the benefits continue through March. Through the end of the quarter, Tamara confirmed. He read the agreement. He read all 12 pages, while Tamara and the legal man sat across from him and tried not to show that they'd expected him to either sign immediately or start shouting. He read the non-disparagement clause, the IP assignment clause, the arbitration clause. He noted the clause that restricted him from approaching Synthera clients directly for 18 months. He noted what was not in the agreement. Any acknowledgement that the work attributed to the CTO's office over the past 3 years was substantially his. He signed. He added his initials to the tabbed pages. He uncapped the pen himself and used his own, a cheap Bic he'd had since the fall, because small dignities were still dignities. Thank you for your contributions to Synthera, Tamara said. It sounded like the end of a form letter. Riker picked up the cactus. He left the cardboard box, and he didn't need any of it. There was nothing in that box that hadn't been replaceable the day he put it there. He picked Maisie up from her after-school program at 4:15. She was wearing her yellow rain boots, which she insisted on wearing regardless of weather, and she ran toward him across the community center parking lot the way she always did, full body, arms out, like running was something she'd only recently discovered and hadn't gotten tired of yet. She was 5 years old and she had her mother's eyes, the particular shade of brown that looked almost amber when the light hit them from the side. She had his jaw and his stubbornness, and a laugh that she deployed strategically, the way some people use punctuation. Daddy. She grabbed his hand with both of hers. We made volcanoes today. With the baking soda? And it went everywhere. She said everywhere like it was the best thing that had ever happened in the history of recorded time. Miss Paulette got some on her sweater.
Did you help clean it up? She considered this with the moral seriousness of a 5-year-old who was deciding whether to be honest. Mostly. He bought groceries on the way home. He had her sit in the cart the way he had since she was 18 months old, even though at this point her legs dangled past the seat, and technically she was too big for it. She held the cactus on the ride home, turning it in her hands carefully. "How come you brought the cactus?" "I thought it might like a change of scenery." She accepted this. She was at an age where the difference between a real reason and a non-answer wasn't always clear, and he appreciated that in her. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Logan Square that had good windows and bad water pressure and a landlord named Gerald who responded to maintenance requests within a reasonable time frame if you included a photograph. It was a 2-bedroom.
Maisie's room had a mural that Riker had painted himself over a long weekend the previous spring. A forest at the edge of a meadow, rabbits in the foreground, a single owl on a branch. He wasn't a painter, you could tell. But Maisie loved it, and that was the only metric that had ever mattered. He made the chicken soup. She sat at the kitchen counter on a stool and monitored the proceedings with the kind of intense supervisory attention that 5-year-olds bring to things they consider important. She told him he was stirring too fast. He thanked her for the note and slowed down. After dinner, he read to her from the book they were working through, a collection of illustrated folk tales with no particular country of origin, something from the library sale box. And by 7:45, she was asleep mid-sentence the way she sometimes did, between one word and the next, as if consciousness was simply something she put down when she was done with it. He sat in the kitchen afterward with a cup of decaf that he didn't really want, and his laptop in the particular quiet of an apartment where the only sound was the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the building settling. He opened a text document and started writing. Not the documentation he'd been composing at Synthera, not the latency report, but something more precise. A full technical accounting of the architecture he'd built, time-stamped and sourced, drawing from the code repositories he still had personal backups of, the architecture diagrams, the planning documents he'd exported to his personal drive on a hunch more than a plan. He wrote for 2 hours. Then he saved it and closed the laptop and washed the soup pot and went to bed. He slept 7 hours. He always slept 7 hours. He had learned during the worst period of his life, during Claire's illness and the months after, that sleep was not optional, that a person who didn't sleep became a worse version of everything, a worse father and a worse thinker and a worse person to be around, and that Maisie needed the best version of him he could manage, not the wrung-out ghost who ran on grief and caffeine. He'd made himself a rule: sleep, eat, show up. Everything else was secondary. The first week after Synthera was quiet in a way that had texture to it. He'd applied for unemployment, which was humbling in the mechanical way that bureaucratic processes are humbling. The forms, the documentation, the phone hold music. He'd called his sister Denise in Milwaukee, who said "oh, Rye" in the particular tone she used when she was worried and trying not to show it. He'd told her he was fine, which was approximately true. He'd updated his resume for the first time in 4 years, and the exercise of writing down what he had actually built, stripped of the institutional language, stripped of the titles that didn't reflect the work, was oddly clarifying. On paper, in plain language, what he had done was significant. He took Maisie to the Lincoln Park Conservatory on a Thursday when the temperature crept above 30 and felt almost mild by comparison. She spent 40 minutes staring at a particular specimen of barrel cactus in the desert room with the focused reverence of someone encountering an old friend in an unexpected location. "It looks like yours," she said. "A bit. Is it lonely?" "I think it has enough company." She thought about this. "People can be lonely with lots of company around." He looked at her. "Where did you hear that?" She shrugged. "I just thought it." He crouched down next to her, at her level, looking at the cactus. "Yeah," he said. "That's true." On the morning of the 9th day after his firing, he woke at 5 a.m., not because his alarm went off, but because his brain had been running the Eastern Cluster problem in the background the way it always did with unresolved systems issues, and something had resolved in his sleep. He lay in bed for 7 minutes, working through the logical structure, and then got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. The latency anomaly he'd flagged, the one Daniel had ignored twice, was not, as he'd initially suspected, a load-balancing misconfiguration. He'd been close, but not quite. What he understood now, turning it over in the dark kitchen, was that it was a cascading dependency failure that originated in the authentication layer. Specifically, in the perimeter security protocol he'd built, there was a scheduled key rotation process that had been modified. Someone had changed the rotation interval from 72 hours to 96 hours, probably to reduce computational overhead, probably without fully understanding what they were touching. And the modification had introduced a gap in the token validation sequence that would widen gradually over time. Gradually. Until it didn't. Until it was sudden. He knew exactly when it would become sudden. He'd run the numbers. He'd been running them in his sleep, apparently. He wrote for 3 hours. He didn't open his laptop. Legal pad, pencil, the careful working out of the problem in the way he'd always thought best, by hand, slowly, with the visual logic of diagrams and arrows and boxes. When he was done, he had 6 pages of notes and a complete remediation plan. The exact sequence of steps needed to close the authentication gap, restore proper token validation, and patch the dependency chain before the cascade reached critical. He sat and looked at it for a while. He had no obligation to Synthara. The separation agreement was explicit on what he owed them: silence, non-disparagement, the intellectual property of any work he'd created during employment. It said nothing about what he owed them after employment, because no one had imagined a scenario in which he would voluntarily provide anything. He thought about Daniel Marsh. He thought about the 12-page separation agreement. He thought about Tamara's voice saying thank you for your contributions like a form letter. Then he opened his laptop and typed the remediation plan into a clean document. Clear, thorough, professionally formatted, exactly the kind of documentation he'd always produced. And he looked up Synthara's general inquiry email and the direct email of the company's owner, which was publicly listed on the corporate website, and he sent it to both. He didn't include his name in the subject line. He included it at the bottom, after the technical content, because the technical content was the point and his name was incidental. Then he went and woke Maisie up for school and made her oatmeal and found her left rain boot under the couch where it had no logical reason to be and didn't think about the email again. Victoria Sterling had built Synthara Technologies from a licensing dispute and $60,000 in borrowed capital over the course of 8 years, and she did not consider herself a sentimental person. She considered herself a precise one. Sentiment was imprecise. It made you hold on to things longer than was useful and let go of things earlier than was strategic. Precision was the discipline of knowing the difference. She was 31 years old. She used a wheelchair. These two facts occupied different amounts of space in how other people related to her, and the relationship between those facts and how she related to herself was something she'd spent considerable effort calibrating. The accident had happened 4 years ago. She didn't discuss it in detail, not because it was painful, though it was, but because the details had become a story people told about her, and she had strong feelings about which stories she permitted to define her. She walked into buildings in a wheelchair and she ran a company worth $400 million, and she did not, as a rule, permit anyone to express surprise about either of these things in her presence. Her office was on the 32nd floor of the Synthara building on West Monroe, glass on 3 sides, Chicago sprawling flat and gray and enormous below. She kept it minimally decorated: a few plants, a whiteboard that was almost always full, a framed print of Lise Meitner that her graduate school advisor had given her, which she'd kept out of genuine affection and kept here as a small private joke about what it meant to be the smartest person in a room and still be written out of the story. She was at her desk at 6:45 a.m. reviewing Q3 infrastructure spend projections when her head of operations, a methodical man named Owen Chu, knocked and came in looking the way Owen looked when something bad was already happening and getting worse. "Eastern cluster is down," he said. Victoria set down the projections. "How much of it?" 30% and growing. Authentication failures started around midnight. IT flagged it at 2. Daniel's team has been on it since 4, and they... Owen paused. He was choosing his words with the deliberateness of someone who knew that the words he was choosing were going to matter. "They don't know what they're looking at." "What does Daniel say?" "Daniel says it's a known issue being addressed," which means Daniel doesn't know either. Owen didn't respond because his silence was the response. Victoria picked up her phone. No new messages from Daniel's office. She checked the internal incident log. 3 separate tickets open since 2 a.m., each with a different description of the same symptom, none with a coherent diagnosis. "Get me the full incident log," she said, "and get me the authentication architecture documentation. All of it." There's an issue there. Owen's expression shifted slightly. The documentation in the internal wiki doesn't match the actual deployed system. There are significant portions of the system with no documentation at all. She looked at him. "Daniel's office has been managing the architecture records for the past 2 years," Owen said carefully, "and some of the records appear to have been reorganized." "Reorganized," she repeated, "or removed." She sat with this for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "Get me the Git repository, full commit history. I want to see who wrote what." Well, she spent 8 hours in the code. This was not something she did routinely. She had teams for this, architects and security leads and systems analysts. But the routine had produced a situation in which the systems were failing and no one in the routine understood them, and so she suspended the routine and did it herself. She had been a software engineer before she was an executive. She had written network security protocols in her 20s. She was not current on the specific architecture Synthera was running, but she understood architecture at the level of someone who had built things from the foundation up, and what she found when she read the commit history was not what she had expected. The commits told a story. Code has its own authorship, patterns of logic, structural choices, the particular way a mind approaches a problem, and it doesn't lie the way credit memos lie. She worked backward through 3 years of commits, tracking authorship tags, noting where names changed in the metadata, but the logic remained consistent, noting where the documentation written by one author described code committed under another name. By 3 p.m., she had a picture she didn't entirely want to have. There was a systematic pattern. Contributions logged under Daniel Marsh's credentials, his authentication tokens, his ID, that did not stylistically or structurally resemble anything else Daniel Marsh had ever written. Contributions that matched, in precision and in architectural logic, a cluster of earlier commits under a different name, a name that appeared consistently in the commit history through 3 years ago and then stopped appearing. Riker Hale. She searched the employee database, terminated 9 days ago. She found his original architecture documentation, not in the main wiki, which had been cleaned, but in a backup repository that hadn't been fully migrated after a server update 2 years ago, the kind of digital corner that gets dusty because it isn't on anyone's priority list. The documentation was meticulous. It included design rationale, dependency maps, failure mode analysis. There were notes in the margins, actual margin notes, in a document exported from what looked like a tablet, handwritten style annotations in a different layer. And the notes were the kind that a person writes when they're explaining something to themselves, working out the logic in real time, not performing expertise, but actually exercising it. At the bottom of the architecture document, dated 18 months ago, was a section titled Known Failure Risks, Unaddressed. It listed 3 issues. The second one described, with specific technical detail, exactly the authentication gap that was currently collapsing the Eastern Cluster. She read it twice. Then she checked her email. She had 347 unread messages, which was not unusual for a Monday. What was unusual was that 2 of them, sent this morning, contained a complete technical remediation plan for the Eastern Cluster failure, signed at the bottom by someone who should have had no reason to ever contact this company again. Victoria sat for a long moment, very still, looking at the screen. Then she called Owen. "Find me an address for Riker Hale," she said. "The former employee? Is this?" "Yes, now please." She looked at Lise Meitner on the wall, the physicist who helped discover nuclear fission and whose name was left off the Nobel Prize, who kept working anyway, in a basement, because the work needed to be done. She didn't think of herself as a sentimental person, but some things had an emotional logic that precision couldn't argue with. The snow started just after 5, light and then heavy, the way Chicago snow commits to the bit once it decides to show up. By 6 o'clock, the streets had that muted quality that heavy snowfall gives to cities. The sound compressed, everything slightly softened and slightly less certain. Riker was at the kitchen table when the knock came. Maisie was in the living room with the television on, some animated show about a rabbit who solved neighborhood problems, which she had seen enough times that she narrated along with it. a habit that Riker found both amusing and slightly alarming in terms of the sheer number of episodes she'd memorized. He wasn't expecting anyone. He looked at the door for a moment, then stood. The woman in the hallway was in a wheelchair, a sleek, functional one that she maneuvered with the casual efficiency of someone who had long since stopped thinking about the act of maneuvering it. She was in her early 30s, dark-haired, in a jacket and slacks that said she'd come from an office and either hadn't stopped home or hadn't cared to. Her expression was the expression of someone who had prepared a number of possible openings and was now evaluating which one fit the situation. "Riker Hale," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," he said. "I'm Victoria Sterling. I own Synthera Technologies." A brief pause. "I'd like to talk to you." He looked at her. He thought about the document he'd sent that morning. He thought about Maisie in the next room, narrating along with the rabbit. He thought about the snow. "It's cold in the hall," he said, and stepped back from the door. She came in. He moved the kitchen chair out of the way. The apartment was not large, and the layout required a small adjustment, and she came to the kitchen table without being directed to it, as though she could read the geography of the space. She set a bag on the table. She didn't look around the apartment the way some people did, cataloging, assessing. She looked at him. "You sent the remediation plan this morning," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because the problem needed fixing." She studied him. There was something direct about the way she looked at people, something that had probably gotten her in trouble in rooms where directness wasn't welcome, which was a lot of rooms. "You were fired 9 days ago. The company that fired you is experiencing exactly the failure you warned about months ago in documentation that was suppressed. And your response was to send a detailed repair manual without asking for anything. I asked for nothing, correct? I'd like to understand that." "There isn't a lot to understand." He glanced toward the living room, reflexively. Maisie's narration had quieted slightly, which could mean she'd gotten absorbed in the episode, or it could mean she was listening. The system was going to fail. People depend on that system. It seemed like the relevant facts. "You could have let it fail." "Yeah." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I could have." There was a small sound from the doorway. Maisie stood there in her socked feet, looking at Victoria with the particular frank curiosity of a 5-year-old who had not yet learned that staring at people was considered rude, or who had learned it and was choosing to disregard it. "Why are you in a wheelchair?" Maisie asked. "Maisie," Riker said, "it's all right." Victoria looked at Maisie directly, no softening, no special pitch. "I had an accident. My legs don't work the way they used to." Maisie processed this. "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore." Maisie nodded, accepting this as a complete and satisfactory answer. She pointed at the terracotta pot on the windowsill. "That's our cactus. Daddy brought it home." "I see it," Victoria said. "It looks healthy." "It gets a lot of sun on weekends." Maisie turned to Riker. "Can I have a snack?" "You just had dinner." "A small snack." He got up and got her a small bowl of crackers, and she went back to the living room and the rabbit. And he came back to the table, and Victoria was watching the empty doorway with an expression he couldn't fully read. "Her name's Maisie," he offered. "I gathered." She turned back to him. "She's 5? "Just turned 5 in October." There was a pause. Victoria opened the bag and set a folder on the table. Printed documents, tabs at the edges, the kind of thing assembled in a conference room somewhere by someone who'd had maybe 3 hours of sleep. "I've spent today reviewing the code repository," she said. "Commit history, authentication architecture, the documentation backup in the legacy server." She paused. "I also found your failure risk memo from 18 months ago, the one about the authentication gap. Daniel got a copy." "Daniel got 2 copies." Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it. "I'd like to know everything you can tell me about how the work was credited over the past 3 years." So he told her. Not angrily. He'd processed most of the anger in the first year and the rest of it during Claire's illness, when anger at a corporation had seemed not unimportant, but certainly secondary to everything else. He told her the way you tell someone a technical account of something that happened, starting at the beginning, following the sequence, not editorializing. He told her about the distributed systems framework he'd designed in a 2-week sprint during a period when Synthera's original vendor had walked out mid-contract and no one else knew what to do.
He told her about the authentication architecture and the perimeter security protocol and the months of patchwork and documentation.
He told her about the meetings he hadn't been included in, the presentations where his diagrams had appeared under someone else's name, the performance reviews where his contributions were described as team efforts and Daniel's name appeared at the top. Victoria listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both technical, both precise. She had clearly read the documentation carefully. When he was done, she sat for a moment. "Why didn't you fight it?" she asked. "You had documentation, version history. You could have—" "Claire got sick." He said it simply, the way you say something you've said enough times that the roughest edges have smoothed. Maisie's mother. She was sick for 14 months, and then she died, and I was the only person available to hold this family together. I didn't have the bandwidth to simultaneously sue a corporation. He looked at his hands. And then she was gone, and I was still the only person available to hold this family together. Just a different version of it. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Outside, snow. Inside, the rabbit on television explaining something to someone, Maisie's small voice filling in the words. "I'm sorry," Victoria said. And it wasn't a form letter. It was the other kind. "I know," he said, because he could tell the difference. She stayed for 2 more hours. They worked through the remediation plan together. She asked questions, he answered them, and several times she caught something he'd left implicit and asked him to make it explicit, which told him she understood the architecture at a level of detail he hadn't expected. By 9 p.m., they had a plan that was better than what he'd sent that morning, cleaner in 2 specific places, and she had a complete picture of what the Eastern Cluster needed. When she left, she paused at the door. "I'm going to do something about what happened to you," she said. "I want you to know that before anything else happens." He looked at her. The system matters more than the credit. Both matter. She said it with a firmness that wasn't quite an argument, but wasn't entirely negotiable either. "I'll be in touch." He closed the door. He stood in the front hall for a moment in the quiet, listening to Maisie in the other room, the television, the snow on the windows. The cactus on the sill caught the light from the kitchen. He went to check if Maisie had fallen asleep on the couch again. She had. He carried her to bed and stayed until she shifted onto her side, and then he went and sat at the kitchen table again with his legal pad, and he wrote down 3 things he needed to remember in the morning. The grocery list, he still hadn't finished, the name of the specific code library that would need to be patched in step 4 of the remediation, and the fact that Maisie's allergist appointment was in 6 weeks, and he still hadn't confirmed the insurance. Small things. Necessary things. He turned off the kitchen light at 11 and went to bed. Outside, Chicago was white and quiet, and somewhere across the city, in an office on the 32nd floor, a woman in a wheelchair was still reading code, his code, making her way through the architecture of something he'd built alone in the dark, learning its corners, understanding its shape. The remediation plan worked. Not cleanly, nothing that size worked cleanly, but by Tuesday morning, the Eastern Cluster had stabilized enough that the cascade Riker had predicted stopped advancing, and by Wednesday, the authentication gap was patched, and the token validation sequence was restored, and the system was running at 94% capacity, which was not perfect, but was survivable, which was more than it had been 48 hours earlier. Victoria knew this because she had been in the building for most of those 48 hours. She'd gone home once for 4 hours, to sleep and change, and she'd come back before her own night shift engineers had left. Owen had stopped suggesting she delegate at some point around 2 a.m. Tuesday because he'd run out of tactful ways to phrase it, and she had run out of patience for tact. This was her company. These were her systems. And the fact that they were failing because someone had buried a 5-year-old's capabilities under someone else's name and then walked that 5-year-old out the door. That was something she needed to understand from the inside out, not from a summary someone else wrote. She was at her desk Thursday morning, coffee going cold beside her keyboard, when Daniel Marsh knocked on her open office door. He came in the way he always did, proprietary, like he'd been in this office more times than she had, which wasn't true, but was the implication his posture carried. He was in a good suit. His tie was blue. He looked like a man who had heard that the crisis was passing and had decided this was a good moment to reposition himself in the narrative. "Wanted to check in," he said, settling into the chair across from her without being invited. "Sounds like the team got the cluster issue under control." "The cluster issue?" she repeated. Engineering did good work under pressure. That's what you want to see. She looked at him. She had a particular expression she used in conversations like this. Not cold exactly, more like zero temperature, like she'd removed heat from the room by an act of deliberate calibration. Daniel didn't notice it. He rarely noticed things that weren't about him. I've been reviewing the architecture documentation, she said. Good. We've been meaning to do a full audit for a while, honestly. Some of that legacy documentation needs the commit history in the main repository, she continued, over him. Shows a pattern I'd like you to explain. A pause. Not long. Daniel was good at recovering his footing quickly. It was one of his actual skills. But present. Sure. What are you seeing? Contributions logged under your credentials that don't match your technical signature. Work that's architecturally consistent with earlier commits by an analyst named Riker Hale, who was terminated 9 days ago. She kept her voice level. She had not gotten to where she was by letting anger do the talking before evidence had finished making its point. I'd like you to explain the discrepancy. Daniel shifted. Almost imperceptible. Almost. Development teams collaborate. Attribution gets complicated when multiple engineers are working on... He wasn't credited as an engineer. Her voice was still level. He was classified as a senior systems analyst. And the contributions in the commit history aren't collaboration. They're wholesale. Architecture, design rationale, documentation. The comments in the code match his style from 3 years of earlier commits. You were logging his work under your name. The temperature of the room had actually changed. Daniel felt it. She watched him feel it. Victoria. He used her name the way people use names when they want to suggest intimacy they haven't earned. This is a complex situation. There were contributions from a lot of people over a long period, and I found his failure risk memo. She pulled the printed document from the folder on her desk and set it on the table between them. The one he sent you 18 months ago. The one that described the exact authentication gap that just took 30% of our Eastern cluster offline. She let him look at it for a moment. I found 2 copies in your email. You marked them both red. Silence. I'd like to understand, she said, how a documented, predicted, specific system failure went unaddressed for 18 months. Daniel was quiet. He was doing the math, the way guilty people do math, when they realize the numbers aren't going to come out in their favor no matter how you arrange them. I'll need to talk to legal, he said finally. Yes, she said. You will. After he left, she sat for a moment in the quiet. The Chicago skyline was overcast, flat gray clouds that hadn't decided yet whether to deliver on their implied promise of snow. She thought about what came next. It was a particular kind of thinking she'd developed over years of making decisions in situations where every option had a cost. The kind that sets aside preference and asks only what is actually true. And what does the truth require? What was true was that Daniel Marsh had taken credit for another man's work for 3 years and had suppressed documentation that would have prevented a significant system failure. What was true was that the man whose work it was had been fired without ceremony or acknowledgement, and had then sent the company a complete repair manual from his kitchen table without asking for a single thing. What the truth required was something the board was not going to enjoy hearing. She picked up her phone and called Owen. I need a full board meeting, she said. End of week. Mandatory attendance. Meanwhile, across the city in Logan Square, Riker had begun doing the thing he always did when a large external situation was no longer in his hands. He focused on the small and the immediate. He took Maisie to her library story time on Thursday afternoon. He replaced a leaking faucet connector under the kitchen sink, a 20-minute job that Gerald the landlord had been promising to handle since September. He made a grocery run. He responded to 2 LinkedIn messages from former colleagues who had apparently heard something through the unofficial network of people who hear things, and reached out in the vague but genuine way that said, I don't know exactly what happened, but I want you to know I see you. He didn't apply to any new positions. He wasn't sure why. Partly inertia. Partly the lingering technical distraction of knowing the cluster remediation was ongoing and finding his brain still solving problems at the edges that weren't his problems anymore. Partly something harder to name, a suspension of the normal momentum of job searching, like his own instincts were waiting for something to resolve before they committed to a direction. Maisie, who had no awareness of any of this and wouldn't have cared about most of it even if she did, was in the middle of a developmental obsession with the question of fairness. She raised it constantly and in varying contexts. It was fair or it was not fair, and the line was drawn with a 5-year-old's particular absolutism. "It's not fair," she told him Thursday evening, "that I have to go to bed before the rabbit show ends." "That's true," he said. "It's also not changing." "But why?" "Because sleep matters." She considered this. "Does the rabbit sleep?" "Probably. I assume rabbits sleep." "I don't think the rabbit on TV sleeps." She was very certain about this. "The rabbit is always awake." "The rabbit on TV has different rules than you do." She thought about this with genuine philosophical engagement for a moment. "Is that fair?" "No," he said honestly, "but it's how it is." She accepted this with more grace than he expected. She went to bed without much protest, which usually meant she was more tired than she was letting on. He sat in the kitchen after she fell asleep and thought about fairness for a while. He didn't have Maisie's absolutism about it. He'd had too many years of watching the gap between how things should work and how they did work to maintain that absolutism intact. But he understood the instinct. The instinct was right, even when the world made it impractical. His phone buzzed at 9:30. A message from a number he didn't have saved, which turned out to be Victoria. "Cluster is at 94%. Your patch on step 4 was cleaner than the one I drafted. The board meeting is Friday. I wanted you to know." He looked at the message for a moment. He typed, "Good. 94 is stable enough if the monitoring is set right." A minute later, "It is. Owen set the alert thresholds this morning." Then, after a pause, "How's the cactus?" He looked at the cactus on the windowsill. He wasn't sure why she'd asked. He typed, "Still alive." "Good," she sent back, and that was the end of it. He put the phone down and went to bed. Tuts. The board meeting was in the large conference room on the 31st floor, 8 people around a table that could have held 12. A projector screen at one end, coffee and insulated carafes that nobody was touching. Victoria had been in this room for board meetings before, both quarterly reviews, strategic planning sessions, the occasional crisis debrief, and she knew the temperature of it before she entered. Today, it was the temperature of people who had been told the agenda in advance and had spent the preceding 24 hours preparing their responses. There were people in this room who liked Daniel, people who had worked with him for years, who golfed with him, who had taken his word for things the way you take someone's word when they've been telling you what you want to hear for long enough that you stop thinking to verify it. She presented the case without commentary. The commit history projected on the screen in the precise details she'd spent 2 days compiling. The architecture documentation. The failure risk memos dated with the read receipts. The timeline of the Eastern Cluster failure mapped against the 18-month gap during which the documented risk had been sitting in Daniel's inbox unaddressed. She let the data do what data does when it's complete and accurate and has no personal stake in the outcome. The room was very quiet for a long time after she finished. Harlan Briggs, who had been on the board since before Victoria took the company over, and who had always had a fondness for Daniel that was specific enough that Riker suspected it was not entirely professional, spoke first. This could be interpreted a number of ways, he said. He was 63, silver-haired, the particular kind of careful that comes from decades of managing liability. Collaborative code development, cross-team attribution. "Harlan!" She kept her voice level, the way she kept it level in every room where the pressure was to soften the truth. "I've been in the code. I've read the commit history line by line. This is not collaborative attribution. This is one person's work appearing under another person's name, consistently, over 3 years, while the person who wrote it was classified below his actual role and eventually fired. The man received severance. He received 16 weeks of severance and a non-disparagement agreement for building the infrastructure this company runs on." She paused. "And then, 9 days after he was terminated, with no legal obligation to do anything at all, he sent us a complete remediation plan for a failure our own team couldn't diagnose, without asking for money or credit or an apology." She let that sit for a moment. "I want the board to understand what kind of person we're talking about before we have the conversation about what we owe him." Harlan was quiet. The other board members were quiet. One of them, Priya Anand, who was 44 and had joined the board 2 years ago, and who was the kind of precise thinker who became more useful in exactly this kind of situation, leaned forward. "What is it that you want to do?" Priya asked. "I want to restore his name to every piece of documentation and intellectual property he created. I want his termination reviewed and formally reclassified. I want his severance revisited. And I want to offer him a position that reflects what he actually does." She paused. "And I want Daniel Marsh's employment terminated with cause." Harlan moved in his chair. "That's aggressive. If Daniel disputes, he won't." She picked up the last document in the folder, a single page, printed, which she placed in the center of the table. "Daniel's legal team contacted our legal team yesterday morning. He's already negotiating his own exit terms. He knows what the evidence shows." The room absorbed this. "He should have caught it earlier," Owen said from his seat near the door, quietly, almost to himself. He wasn't a board member, but he was in the room because Victoria had wanted him there, and that was sufficient. The failure. He had the memo. "He had 2 memos, Victoria said. He chose not to act on either." Priya looked at the page in the center of the table. "The man, Riker Hale, does he know you're doing this?" "He knows the board meeting is happening. I told him that." She looked at the window, the city, the overcast sky. "He didn't ask me to fight for him. He doesn't seem to do that, ask for things. But he was right about the system, and he fixed it anyway, and the least this company can do is tell the truth about who built it." The vote took 11 minutes. Harlan abstained. Everyone else was in favor. She called him that evening. Not a text. A call, which felt like the right distinction for what she needed to say. He picked up on the 3rd ring, slightly breathless, and she could hear Maisie in the background asking about something with the particular urgency children assign to questions they've been holding for a while. "1 second," he said, to Maisie, not to her, and then there was the muffled sound of him handling whatever the immediate situation was, and then he came back. "Sorry, we're in the middle of a negotiation about pajamas." "Who's winning?" "She is. She always is." There was a faint shift in his voice, some amusement or something adjacent to it. "What happened?" She told him. The board meeting, the vote, Daniel's quiet exit. She told him his name was going back onto the documentation, that the IP attribution would be formally corrected, that HR was reviewing his termination classification. He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. She waited. "That's it? Okay? What else should I say?" She didn't have a good answer to that. She thought about what she'd expected. Relief, maybe, or anger finally surfaced, or the particular catharsis of someone hearing that the record was being set straight. What she got was a man who sounded tired and calm, and like he had a 5-year-old waiting for him, and that remained the primary relevant fact. "There's a position," she said. "If you want it, head of infrastructure architecture. It's what you've been doing anyway. It would just say so on paper." A longer pause this time. Outside her window, snow had finally decided to commit. Thin and steady, covering the city in the unhurried way that large accumulations always started. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Yes. I have questions. I'd be surprised if you didn't. I'll call you tomorrow," he said. Then away from the phone. "I said 1 minute, Maisie." "Okay, fine." And then back to her. "I have to go, but Victoria." "Yeah, thank you." He said it simply. Not performatively. The way you say something when you mean it precisely and don't need it dressed up. For reading the code, most people wouldn't have. She looked at the snow on the window. "I needed to understand what I was dealing with." "I know," he said, still. After he hung up, she sat with the quiet for a while, which was something she rarely permitted herself, sitting with things instead of moving directly to the next thing. She thought about the woman on her wall, the physicist in the basement, and the particular stubbornness required to keep doing necessary work when the institution around you had decided you weren't worth the credit. She thought about a man carrying a cactus out of a building because everything else in the box belonged to a company that had already taken enough. She pulled up her email and started drafting the formal offer letter. She wrote it herself without delegating to HR because some things needed to be written by the person who meant them. Outside, Chicago was going white again, slow and certain, covering everything that had been there before. He called her the next morning at 8:47, which she knew because she was already at her desk and her phone was face up, and she'd been checking it more than she would have admitted to anyone, including Owen, who had the discretion not to mention it. "You said you had questions," she answered. 3 of them. His voice had the quality it always had. Measured, not flat, the kind of calm that came from practice rather than temperament. She'd started to understand the difference. First, the position would be head of infrastructure architecture. What does that actually mean in terms of authority? Not title. Authority. She had expected this. Final sign-off on all infrastructure decisions. Your recommendations on systems design go to me directly, not through a chain that can sit on them. You build the team you need. Who do I answer to? Me. A pause. That's a short chain. That's intentional. Second question, he said. The documentation correction, when you restore my name to the IP records, is that a quiet internal adjustment or is it a matter of public record? She considered how to answer that. What would you prefer? I'd prefer it to be accurate, he said. I don't need a press release. I need the record to be true in case Maisie ever looks it up someday and wants to know what her father actually built. She sat with that for a moment. It was the kind of answer that made it difficult to maintain the executive distance she normally kept between herself and the humans on the other side of her decisions. It will be accurate, she said, fully documented, legally corrected, permanent. Third question. A brief pause, and in that pause she heard something that might have been him deciding whether to ask it at all. The offer. Is it because you feel like you owe me something, or because you actually need someone who can do the work? It was a direct question. She respected it enough to answer it directly. Both. I'm not going to pretend the circumstances don't create an obligation because they do, and I believe in acknowledging that. But if the obligation was the only reason, I'd write you a check and call it settled. I need someone who can do the work. The Eastern Cluster proved that the person doing the work has not been the person with the title. I want to fix that permanently. Quiet on the line. Okay, he said. Okay, you'll take it, or okay, you heard me. Both, he said, which was almost exactly what she'd just said to him, and she recognized the echo and wasn't sure what to do with it. I have one condition. Tell me. Maisie's school pickup is at 4:15. On days I can't make it, I need enough notice to arrange coverage. That's not negotiable. She had negotiated contracts worth 9 figures in this office. She had sat across from men who used every possible leverage to extract concessions. None of them had asked for anything that required less deliberation. That's not a condition, she said. That's a scheduling note. Done. Then, yes, he said. I'll take it. After she hung up, she sat for a moment and noticed, with some irritation because she preferred her own reactions to be legible to her, that she was in a better mood than she'd been in all week. Riker's first official day at Synthera was a Monday in late January, 3 weeks after the board meeting, and it was nothing like the last time he'd walked into that building, the last time he'd been invisible by design. This time, Priya Anand was in the lobby when he arrived. She'd made a point of being there, he understood, not as ceremony, but as acknowledgement, the board's way of saying, we know what we did, and we're not pretending otherwise. And she shook his hand and said, welcome back, with the particular weight of someone who understood the inadequacy of the phrase and chose it anyway because some moments don't have better language. His office was on the 28th floor, not the executive floor. He hadn't asked for that, but a real office, glass-walled, with a window that faced south. He set the cactus on the windowsill before he unpacked anything else. Owen came by at 9 with a systems overview and the kind of frank expression that said he was there to actually work, not to perform a welcome. Riker appreciated this immediately. They spent 2 hours going through the current state of the infrastructure, what had been patched, what remained fragile, what had been deferred so long it had crossed from maintenance into structural risk. It was not a pretty picture. The Eastern Cluster incident had been the loudest symptom of a pattern of neglect that went back at least 2 years, and the neglect had the specific texture of decisions made by someone who understood optics better than engineering. How long has it been like this? Riker asked. He was looking at a dependency map that had the visual complexity of something that had grown without a plan, patched and repatched until the patches had patches. Since about the time the documentation stopped being updated, Owen said, which was the time Daniel had stopped needing Riker to produce it, because Daniel had been presenting the existing architecture as ongoing original work. Once there was no more original work to absorb, the system had simply been left to run on what it had. I'll need to rebuild the team, Riker said. Some of the people in infrastructure are good. Some of them have been managing up instead of managing the systems. I need to know which is which before I start reassigning anything. That's going to create some friction. Probably. He looked at the dependency map. What's the status on the Northern Cluster authentication? Owen pulled up a screen. Stable, but not right. Riker finished the sentence because the number on the screen had told him. It's running on the same token validation sequence as the Eastern Cluster was before the patch. Nobody extended the fix. Owen was quiet for a moment. No. Okay? Riker picked up a pen and started writing on the legal pad he'd brought from home because the office hadn't been stocked yet. That's first. He worked through lunch. He didn't intend to. He'd brought a sandwich specifically to avoid the habit. But the sandwich sat on the corner of his desk unopened because the Northern Cluster issue had a secondary dependency that unwound into a third thing. And by the time he surfaced from the thread, it was 2:30, and the sandwich was room temperature, and he ate it standing up while reading a monitoring report, which was not ideal but was honest. Victoria appeared in his doorway at 4. She didn't knock, which he noticed. Not rudely. There was something comfortable about it, like the difference between someone who assumes they're welcome and someone who knows they are. She looked at the whiteboard he'd commandeered, which was now covered in architecture diagrams and dependency chains and several large question marks he hadn't resolved yet. How bad? She asked. It's not catastrophic. He looked at the board. It's like a house where the owners kept painting over the cracks instead of fixing the foundation. Structurally, it's still standing. But you have to actually fix the cracks now, or the next winter does more damage than this one did. She wheeled to the side of the room where she could see the board from the angle he'd drawn it. He appreciated that she actually looked at it, not the performed interest look that executives sometimes gave technical documentation, but the real kind, the kind where the eyes move. Northern Cluster is the priority, she said. You saw the same number Owen showed me. I had Owen show me the same number he showed you, yes. A faint edge in her voice that wasn't quite dry humor but was in that neighborhood. I don't wait for the summary report. I know, he said. That's why you caught this the first time. She looked at him. He said things like that. Straightforward observations, nothing behind them, no strategy, and it kept catching her slightly off guard, which was its own interesting problem because she was not a person who was easily caught off guard. I have a board debrief at 4:30, she said. Come if you want to read on the room. Don't if you'd rather stay in the weeds. Weeds, he said without hesitation. Figured. She turned toward the door, then stopped. The sandwich is going to fossilize if you don't finish it. He looked at the half-eaten sandwich on his desk. Noted. She left. He turned back to the whiteboard and picked up the pen and kept going. The weeks that followed had a particular rhythm to them that Riker hadn't expected. He'd anticipated resistance, the natural friction of coming into a team as a new authority in a situation where the previous authority had left under bad circumstances. And the resistance was there, but it was less uniform than he'd anticipated. The engineers who were actually good at their jobs responded to him quickly, with the specific relief of people who had been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The ones who had been coasting on Daniel's management style, which had prioritized presentations over problem-solving, took longer. 2 of them requested transfers within the first month. He let them go without drama and replaced them with people he recruited from outside. 2 hires that Owen helped expedite, because the Northern Cluster fix had a deadline, and the deadline was not adjustable. He also inherited a junior engineer named Praxis. Nobody called him by his actual name, which was something complicated in Lithuanian, and Praxis had picked the nickname himself at some point, and it had stuck. Who was 24 years old and had been hired 8 months ago and was, by some margin, the most technically gifted person on the team. Praxis had been ignored almost entirely under the previous structure, assigned to documentation updates and minor patchwork, which was the institutional equivalent of putting a thoroughbred on a treadmill. Riker pulled him into the Northern Cluster project in the second week. You've been here 8 months, Riker said, standing at the whiteboard with the dependency map that had grown more annotated daily. What's the stupidest decision in this architecture, in your opinion? Praxis blinked.
He was young enough that the question threw him, because in his 8 months at Synthara, no one had ever asked him what he thought about anything. "You want my—" "Yes." Praxis looked at the board. He pointed without hesitation to a section in the upper left that Riker had himself circled 3 days ago with a question mark next to it. "That load distribution model. It's redundant in 2 places, and the redundancy creates lag that's downstream into the authentication handoff," Riker finished. "Yeah." He handed Praxis the pen. "Show me what you'd do instead." Praxis looked at the pen like it might be a test. "It's a whiteboard," Riker said. "It erases." Praxis took the pen. He drew for 4 minutes without stopping, and what he drew was not perfect. There were 2 places where the logic had a gap that Riker could see and Praxis probably would have found if he'd kept going. But the underlying instinct was sound, more than sound. It was the kind of thinking that comes from actually understanding systems rather than managing descriptions of them. "2 problems," Riker said, and pointed to them. "Here and here." Praxis looked. His expression changed from tentative to focused. "The latency window. And the fallback. If the primary path fails during the handoff, it has nowhere to—" He stopped. He saw it. "I need a secondary route." "You need a secondary route," Riker confirmed. "Draw it." Praxis drew it. It wasn't a perfect solution. It took 3 more sessions over the following week to refine it into something deployable. And there was one afternoon where they were both at the board and arguing, genuinely arguing, Praxis pushing back on Riker's approach to the fail-safe logic with the kind of directness that Riker actively encouraged, and that had clearly been beaten out of the kid by 8 months of being told his job was to update documentation. And they landed on something neither of them had walked in with, which was the best possible outcome. The Northern Cluster fix went live in the 3rd week of February. It ran clean. Owen sent Riker an email at 11 p.m. that night that said only 94 just became 99. "Good work." Riker saw it in the morning and replied, "Praxis did the hard part." Owen forwarded both messages to Victoria, who forwarded them to Praxis, who did not respond for 6 hours because he had apparently printed the email and been unable to speak for a portion of that time. Victoria noticed things. It was a professional habit that had become a personal one, the way a surgeon keeps noticing how people hold their bodies even at dinner parties. She noticed the way Riker managed his team, direct, specific, no theater. She noticed that he was in the office before most of his engineers arrived and left reliably at 4, which she understood was the school pickup, and which he had never once been late for, which she knew because she had the security log access, and she wasn't proud of checking it, but she had checked it twice. She noticed that he ate lunch at his desk most days, but had started, in the 3rd week, eating it in the small kitchen on the 28th floor instead, standing at the counter while whoever else was there talked, mostly listening, occasionally saying something that made the other person laugh in the surprised way that meant they hadn't expected it. She noticed that when they disagreed about resource allocation, about timeline, about 2 separate hires where she thought he was moving too slowly, and she said so. He argued with her without performing deference and without performing aggression. He just said what he thought clearly, and then listened to what she said, and they worked it out. It was the least complicated professional dynamic she'd had in years, which was possibly the most complicated thing about it. She was aware that she was thinking about him more than was strictly professional. She was also aware that she had a long-standing habit of converting feelings she didn't know how to categorize into work, and she was working harder than she had in months. So the math was fairly clear. Maisie was part of it. She hadn't expected that. She'd met the child twice, once the night she'd shown up at the apartment, once when Riker had brought her to the office on a Friday when the after-school program was closed, and Maisie had spent 4 hours drawing elaborate diagrams on Riker's whiteboard that she claimed were maps of the rabbit's house, which had apparently grown into a complex multi-building compound since the last episode. Victoria had been passing through for a different meeting entirely, and had stopped in the doorway, and Maisie had looked up and said, "You're back," with the easy confidence of someone to whom this was simply a fact and not particularly remarkable. "I work here," Victoria had said. Maisie had accepted this as the complete explanation it apparently was, and gone back to the rabbit's compound. Riker had been standing at the window with a coffee, watching this exchange with an expression that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite. "She's been talking about you,"
he said, quietly, not to make anything of it. What does she say? He looked briefly uncomfortable, which was rare enough to be notable. She says you seem like someone who doesn't take any nonsense. Victoria considered this. That's accurate. She also says... He stopped. What? He looked at the window. She says you seem lonely. She mentioned it twice, which with Maisie means she's been thinking about it. The thing about the observation was that it came through a 5-year-old, which meant it had bypassed all the filters that adults applied to what they chose to notice and name. It sat in the room without apology. Victoria didn't answer immediately. She looked at Maisie, who was now adding what appeared to be a second story to one of the rabbits' buildings. She's perceptive, she said finally. Yeah, Riker's voice was careful. She gets it from her mother. It was the first time he'd said anything about Claire directly in her presence. She recognized that it wasn't an opening exactly, but it wasn't a door shut either. She sounds like she was something, Victoria said. She was. He looked at his coffee. She would have had approximately 17 opinions about the Northern Cluster fix. She was a network engineer. We used to argue about load distribution models at dinner, which Maisie was too young to remember, but I'm sure informed her personality somehow. The image was vivid enough to be slightly painful. The dinner table, the argument, the child too young to understand it but absorbing the shape of it anyway. That's a specific thing to miss, she said. Everything specific is what you miss, he said. The general version of a person, you don't miss that. You miss the particular way they argued with you. She thought about that for a while after she left. February moved into March with the particular grudging quality of Chicago winter, which does not release gradually but in fits. A day of almost warmth followed by 3 days of cold that felt personal. Maisie's allergist appointment was the second week of March, and Riker left at noon to take her, came back at 3 with Maisie in tow and a pharmacy bag, and the news that the allergy was manageable with a new medication, and did Victoria know there was a very large potted fern in the lobby that Maisie was convinced was hiding something behind its leaves. There's nothing behind it, Victoria said. That's what I said. He set Maisie up at the small table in the corner of his office with crayons and paper. She remains unconvinced. The fern does have a slightly suspicious posture, Victoria said. Maisie looked up. Right? Riker looked at Victoria with the expression of a man who had hoped for backup and not received it. That was the afternoon that something shifted, though neither of them would have been able to name the exact moment. It wasn't dramatic. It was the slow accumulation of small, accurate things. The way he always held the elevator door without being asked. The way she brought 2 coffees when she came to his office because she'd noticed he was always out by 2 p.m. The way they sometimes sat in the same room working in silence, and neither of them felt the need to fill it. The cactus on his windowsill had put out a new growth in late February, a small green shoot at the base, which Maisie had declared a baby cactus, and which Riker tended with the same quiet consistency he brought to everything. One Thursday evening in the 3rd week of March, the building was mostly empty. Riker was finishing a systems review. Maisie was asleep on the small couch in the corner that had appeared in his office sometime in the 2nd week without either of them officially discussing it. Victoria came by at 7 and saw the light still on. She came in and looked at the sleeping child and then at the whiteboard, and then at Riker, who was reviewing a monitoring report and had the look of someone who had been at it long enough that the words were starting to drift. Go home, she said. One more thing. You said that an hour ago. He looked up. How do you know what I said an hour ago? Owen told me you were still here. She moved to look at the monitoring report over his shoulder, which meant she was close enough that the situation had its own kind of gravity. She read for a moment. The alert threshold on Node 7 is wrong. That's what's bothering you. He looked at the report, then at her. Yeah. Fix the threshold. Go home. She looked at Maisie on the couch. She's going to have a neck thing if she sleeps like that much longer. He fixed the threshold. It took 4 minutes. And then he shut the laptop and picked up Maisie with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for 5 years, the child settling against his shoulder without fully waking, one hand gripping his collar the way kids grip things in sleep. Victoria held the door. He looked at her when he went through it. Not a long look. Maisie was heavy, and he needed to get to the elevator, and she had work to get back to, and none of the logistics were romantic. But it was the kind of look that has a thing in it that neither person is ready to say yet, and both people know it, and for the moment, that's enough. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For the alert threshold." She looked at him. "Go home, Riker." He went. She stood in the doorway of his office for a moment after the elevator closed, looking at the cactus on the windowsill, the baby chute at the base, the city going dark and cold outside the glass. She went back to her own office and finished her work and didn't leave until 9, which was later than she'd intended, and the drive home was quiet in the way that felt less lonely than usual, which was information she filed away and did not yet know what to do with. Outside, March was doing its grudging thing. The temperature had dropped again. But somewhere in the building above the city, a small green shoot on a windowsill was still growing, slow and certain, the way things grow when someone remembers to take care of them. The small green shoot at the base of the cactus was half an inch taller by the first week of April, which Maisie monitored with the seriousness of a scientist tracking a long-term experiment. She had started keeping a drawing record of it, a notebook with dated sketches, each one slightly more detailed than the last. The cactus rendered in green crayon with the shoot in a lighter shade that she'd achieved by pressing less hard on the paper. Riker had not suggested this. She had simply decided it was important and begun. He thought about this sometimes during the commute, the way she found things worth tracking, worth documenting, without being told. Claire had been like that. The impulse to make a record, to say this happened and it mattered enough to write down. He didn't know if it was inherited or absorbed or just coincidence, and he supposed it didn't matter. What mattered was that Maisie was paying attention to the world, and that she thought things in it were worth caring about. April at Synthera was a different kind of pressure than January had been. The crisis phase was over. The eastern cluster was stable. The northern cluster fix had held through 6 weeks of normal load without a single critical alert. And Praxis had quietly become the person other engineers came to when they had a problem they couldn't solve, which was the best possible outcome of pulling someone out of documentation purgatory and giving them actual work. The pressure now was the slower, less dramatic pressure of rebuilding. Architecture reviews, hiring decisions, the painstaking work of replacing years of deferred maintenance with something that would hold. It was also the pressure of the board. Harlan Briggs had abstained from the vote in February, which was not the same as voting against it, but was not the same as supporting it either. And in the weeks since, Harlan had been the particular kind of present that powerful men are when they're waiting for a moment to reassert something. He showed up to things he didn't need to attend. He asked questions in board sessions that were structured as questions but functioned as implications. He had lunch twice with 2 board members whose names Riker didn't know well yet, which Owen mentioned in passing with the specific casualness that meant it wasn't casual. Victoria had not said much about Harlan directly. She mentioned him the way you mention weather, as a condition to be navigated rather than a problem to be solved. It became a problem in the second week of April. Riker was in the middle of an infrastructure review with Praxis and 2 other engineers when Owen appeared in the doorway with an expression that had a specific quality to it. Not emergency. Owen's emergency expression was faster, more angular. This was something else, something that required managing. "Victoria needs you," Owen said. "Conference room B, now." Praxis looked at Riker. Riker set down the architecture diagram he'd been holding. "Hold the thread," he told Praxis. "I'll be back." Conference room B was on the 31st floor, which was the board floor, which meant this was not an informal conversation. When Riker came in, Victoria was at the head of the table and Harlan Briggs was seated to her left, with the posture of a man who had arrived early on purpose. 2 other board members, the ones Owen had mentioned at lunch, were also there. There was a lawyer Riker didn't recognize. He sat where Victoria indicated, across from Harlan. "Thank you for coming," Harlan said, with the particular warmth that is indistinguishable from its opposite. "We wanted to discuss the IP attribution correction with you directly." Riker looked at Victoria. Her expression was controlled in the way it got when she was working very hard to keep something specific out of it. "I thought that was settled," Riker said. "Substantially," Harlan said. "There are a few remaining questions about the scope of the attribution, specifically the external licensing agreements that reference the original architecture. Some of those agreements are with clients who have relationships with the board, and there's a concern about how the attribution correction might be communicated publicly." Riker understood immediately what this was. It was not a question about attribution. It was a question about whether Harlan and the board members who had those client relationships wanted their names associated with a company that had publicly admitted to misattributing core intellectual property for 3 years. It was about optics. It was, in the most direct possible translation, about whether Riker's name on the documents would make certain people uncomfortable. The attribution correction is accurate, Riker said. That's not a scope question. We understand that. Harlan's voice had the texture of gravel under carpet. We're asking about the communication strategy. There may be a way to make the correction internally, for record purposes, without the external documentation requiring a full public revision. So you want to fix the records where no one can see them? Harlan smiled. I'd characterize it as a phased approach. I'd characterize it differently. The lawyer shifted in his seat. One of the other board members looked at the table. Victoria had been quiet. She spoke now. Harlan, the attribution correction is legally binding and the documentation revision is already in process. This meeting was called to inform Riker of the board's concerns, which I've now done. The correction is not being modified. Victoria, the client relationships are not more important than the accuracy of our IP records. Her voice was even. Whatever she was keeping out of it was still out of it. If you want to discuss communication strategy for the correction, I'm happy to have that conversation with legal present. What I'm not doing is revising the scope of the correction to protect anyone's relationship with anyone. Harlan looked at Riker. It was a particular kind of look, assessing, recalibrating, the look of a man who had just updated his read on a situation and didn't love what the update said. And you're comfortable with the public attribution, he said to Riker, knowing it will invite scrutiny of the company's previous practices. I'm comfortable with accurate records, Riker said. Scrutiny of previous practices seems like a natural consequence of previous practices. The meeting ended 20 minutes later without resolving anything except the confirmation that it had been a show of force rather than a genuine procedural concern, and that the show of force had not produced the desired effect. In the hallway afterward, Victoria said nothing for a moment, moving beside him toward the elevator. Then, I'm sorry about that. You didn't call the meeting. No, but I should have anticipated it sooner. Harlan's been looking for leverage since February. She pressed the elevator button. He won't find it in the attribution. The legal record is clean. What will he find it in? She looked at him. The elevator opened. He doesn't like that I trust your judgment, she said. He thinks it's a conflict of interest. They got in. The doors closed. Is it? Riker asked. She considered this with the directness she brought to things she could have deflected. It's a relationship that's developed in the course of professional circumstances, which is true of most professional relationships. It's also different from most of mine, which is also true. She paused. Harlan's concern is that I'm making decisions with my judgment compromised. My position is that my judgment is fine. The elevator reached 28. The doors opened. Your judgment is fine, Riker said. I know, she said, and there was something in it, dry, almost, but with a warmth underneath, that he found himself thinking about for the rest of the afternoon. What? What Harlan had actually done, Riker understood over the following week, was make the implicit explicit. The thing that had been developing between himself and Victoria, undefined, unspoken, present in threshold moments and careful distances and 2 coffees instead of 1, was now visible enough that someone had named it, even negatively. That changed its gravity. He sat with this in the evenings after Maisie went to bed. He wasn't a person who processed things quickly or dramatically. He turned them over. He looked at them from different angles, the way he looked at systems problems, not to find the answer he wanted, but to find the answer that was actually there. What was actually there? He thought about her more than he thought about most things that weren't Maisie or the infrastructure. He noticed when she was in a bad mood before she named it, and he noticed when she laughed at something that surprised her, which happened less often than it should have. He noticed that she had a habit of forgetting to eat when she was deep in something and had started, without thinking about it, leaving a second sandwich on his desk on days she came by at lunch, which she hadn't commented on and he hadn't commented on, but which both of them were aware of. He also sat with the harder thing, which was the question of whether he was ready. Claire had been gone for 3 years. 3 years was enough time for the sharpest edges to dull
and not enough time for some of the deeper things to heal completely, and he was honest enough with himself to know the difference. He was not still in grief the way he'd been in the first year, not the active bleeding kind, but healing and ready were not the same thing, and he had Maisie to consider, which was not an excuse. He'd heard people use their children as an excuse, and he found it corrosive, but was a genuine weight.
Maisie had already attached to Victoria in the uncomplicated way she attached to things she decided were trustworthy, and that attachment could not be borrowed against. He was thinking about this on a Saturday afternoon in mid-April when his sister Denise called. Denise was 40, lived in Milwaukee, had 2 kids of her own, and the specific insight into Riker that came from having grown up in the same house with him and watching him become who he was. She called most Saturdays. This one she led with, "You sound different." "I sound the same." "You don't." A pause, and he heard her kid in the background, something about a lost shoe. "You sound like you're thinking about something you're not saying." "I'm always thinking about something I'm not saying." "This is different. This is the version where you've already decided something and you're waiting to see if you're right before you say it out loud." She came back from the shoe situation.
"Is it about a person?" He was quiet long enough that she laughed. "Rye. It's complicated," he said. It's always complicated. What's she like?" He thought about how to answer that. He looked at the cactus on the kitchen windowsill, transplanted home for the weekend. "Direct?" he said. "She doesn't soften things to make them easier to hear. She reads code the way most people read text, which I didn't expect. She brought 2 coffees to my office once and didn't make anything of it. And she has her own version of whatever I have," he said slowly, "the hiding behind the work, the not asking for things." Denise was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you like her, or is that why you're being careful?" He didn't answer immediately. "Both," he said. "That's fair," Denise said. She had the wisdom to leave it there. Pause. The thing that cracked the question open, not dramatically, not with any particular design, was a Tuesday afternoon in the last week of April. Riker had been in back-to-back meetings since morning, the kind of day that consumed itself, and at 3:30 he realized he'd missed lunch entirely, and the node monitoring report he needed for a 4 o'clock review was pulling data from a corrupted log that someone had overwritten during a routine backup. It was a small disaster of the administrative kind, fixable but time-consuming, and he was standing at his desk trying to pull the original log from the backup server when Praxis knocked. "She's looking for you," Praxis said. "Tell her I'm, She already knows. She asked me to tell you anyway." Praxis paused. "She also said to tell you the log is in the secondary archive partition, not the primary. She checked." Riker stopped. He went to the secondary archive. The log was there. He pulled it in 4 minutes and had the monitoring report ready before 4 o'clock, which would not have been possible without the 10 minutes saved by knowing where to look. After the review, he went up to the 32nd floor. Victoria was on a call. He waited outside her office for 3 minutes, and when she came off the call, she saw him through the glass and opened the door. "The log," he said. "I noticed the backup error this morning when I was reviewing the server schedule. I thought you might run into it. You could have sent me a message." "I was going to." She looked at him. Praxis was faster. He stood in the doorway. The afternoon light was doing something specific to the office. The late April sun, lower than it would be in summer, coming through the south windows at an angle that made the room feel warmer than it was. He thought about Denise. He thought about hiding behind the work. "Victoria?" She waited. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "Not a working dinner. Not to discuss the infrastructure review or the board or the attribution correction. Just dinner." The thing that happened to her face was small and would not have been visible to most people. He had spent enough time watching her manage her expressions to know what the unmanaged version looked like. What happened was something loosening, very slightly, in the muscles around her eyes. "Maisie?" she asked. "My sister is coming down next weekend. Maisie loves Denise. She'll be fine." Victoria looked at her hands for a moment, a rare thing, that downward glance. She was almost always direct eye in conversation. Then she looked back up. "Okay," she said. "Okay." "Don't make it somewhere with a tasting menu," she said. "I don't have the patience for 17 courses. I know a place in Wicker Park. 4 things on the menu, no tablecloths." She almost smiled, not quite. "That sounds right." He went back to the 28th floor. Praxis was at the whiteboard when he came in, adding something to the architecture diagram.
and he looked up with the wariness of someone who isn't sure what's coming. Node 7 alert threshold needs rechecking, Riker said, because it did, and sat down and pulled up the monitoring interface, and the afternoon continued, ordinary and necessary, with the specific feeling underneath it of something that had been complicated for a while becoming, quietly, less so yet. Denise arrived Friday evening with her minivan and a bag of cheese curds from a place in Milwaukee that Maisie had decided were the best food ever created, and within 20 minutes of arrival, she and Maisie were on the living room floor constructing an elaborate structure from the building blocks Maisie had been ignoring for 3 months, and which she had apparently been saving for exactly this occasion. Riker changed his shirt twice, which Denise noticed and did not comment on until he came out in the second one. "It's nice," she said, without looking up from the blocks. "It's the same as the first one." "It's not." Maisie looked up. "You look different, Daddy." "How?" She tilted her head. The seriousness of the consideration was complete. "Like you're going somewhere that matters." He looked at Denise. Denise was very focused on the blocks. He left at 7. The restaurant in Whisker Park was the kind of place that had been there for 20 years and had no interest in being discovered. Narrow, 12 tables, a menu on a chalkboard that changed weekly. He'd been once before, years ago, before everything that had happened since. He'd remembered it because the food was direct and good, and nobody performed anything. Victoria was already there when he arrived. He hadn't expected that. He'd imagined he would be the one waiting. She was at a corner table, in a jacket he hadn't seen before, a dark green that looked deliberate. She had her phone face down on the table, which he noticed because it was the opposite of her default. He sat. They looked at each other across a small table with no tablecloth, the way two people look at each other when they've removed the professional context and are seeing what's underneath. "You're on time," he said. "I'm always on time." "You're usually early at work." "This isn't work." She picked up the menu. 4 things. As promised. "The fish," she said. "Definitely the fish." They talked. Not about Synthara, not about the board, not about authentication architecture or IP records or Harlan Briggs and his phased approach to truth. They talked about the things people talk about when they're paying attention to each other rather than to an agenda. She told him about the company she'd started and the specific kind of fear that comes with building something you can't afford to lose. He told her about the years of being invisible at Synthara and why he'd chosen it, not entirely consciously, looking back, but there had been something protective about the invisibility during the hardest years, a way of not being a target when he didn't have the bandwidth to absorb hits. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Which part?" "Not fighting sooner." He thought about it honestly. "No. I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret what I chose to do with my energy during those years." He looked at the table. Maisie needed a father who was present. I was present. That was the right call. She looked at him with the expression she got when she was processing something she hadn't expected. "You're certain about that." "About the only thing I've been fully certain about in a while." She ate the fish. It was good. The conversation moved in the way it does when both people have stopped managing it. Not linearly, doubling back on itself, landing somewhere and then moving on, the way real conversations work rather than performed ones. She told him about the accident, briefly, without drama. A car, black ice, the particular horror of waking up in a hospital and having a doctor explain permanent things using temporary-sounding language. She told him she'd spent 8 months angry in a way she'd never been angry before, at everything and nothing, and that she'd converted most of it into the company and some of it she'd just had to wait out. "Does it still make you angry?" he asked. "Sometimes. Less." She considered. "What makes me angrier now is when people assume it limits what I understand, not what I can physically do. I'm past caring what people think about that. What I understand." The board. Among other examples. "For what it's worth," he said, "the first time I watched you read the architecture documentation, I stopped worrying about what anyone thought of your judgment." She looked at him. The candlelight in the restaurant was doing the thing it does, making everything slightly warmer and slightly more honest. "When was that?" "The night you came to my apartment. You asked 2 technical questions that told me you'd read everything and understood most of it before you knocked on my door." He paused. "I hadn't expected that." "What had you expected?" "An executive," he said simply. "I got something else." The table was quiet for a moment. Outside April Chicago, the particular spring sounds of a city tentatively committing to warmth. Inside, two people at a small table with their phones face down. Riker, she said. Yeah. This is. She stopped, started again. I'm not good at this part. The part where you say what something is. Neither am I, he said honestly. Then we're even, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The waiter came and refilled the water glasses, and they both looked at the water glasses for a moment. I'm not in a hurry, he said finally. I just wanted to be somewhere with you that wasn't the office. She thought about that. And I wanted to see if it was different. He looked at her directly. It is. Yes, she said. It is. That was all. The waiter brought the dessert menu, which neither of them had planned on ordering from, and they both looked at it and ended up ordering the same thing without discussing it first, which Riker didn't comment on but filed somewhere he could find later. They left at 10. The street was cool, and the city was lit up in the particular way of a clear April night, and he walked with her to where her car was waiting, and they stood for a moment on the sidewalk in that specific suspension of not quite ended. Maisie's going to ask where you went, she said. I'll tell her Wicker Park. She'll ask if you had fun. I'll tell her yes. He paused. Did you? She looked at him for a moment with the unmanaged expression, the one that was visible only if you knew what you were looking at. Yes, she said. He watched her car pull away. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the Chicago April night, not thinking about anything specific, just standing in it. He walked back to where he'd parked and drove home and let himself in quietly because Denise was asleep on the couch. Genuinely asleep, not waiting up asleep, mouth slightly open, one of Maisie's picture books face down on her chest. He covered her with the blanket from the arm of the couch and checked on Maisie, who was deeply unconscious in the way of children who have spent 4 hours building things, one hand still loosely holding a block. He set the cactus back on the kitchen windowsill. The baby chute had put out a third small segment, which he hadn't noticed before. He stood looking at it for a moment in the kitchen light. Then he went to bed, and for the first time in a while, he didn't have to wait for sleep to come. The week after Wicker Park, nothing was said directly. This was not avoidance. It was the natural pace of two people who had learned through different kinds of damage not to rush toward things they weren't certain of. They both understood that something had shifted. They simply didn't announce it, the way you don't announce a change in weather that's already visible to everyone standing outside. What changed was small and specific. He started taking his lunch on the 32nd floor twice a week, not always in her office, but in the common space outside it, where she could see him through the glass if she looked up. She started leaving the door open when she was working on something she didn't need privacy for, which she hadn't done before. In meetings, when he said something that cut through to the point before anyone else had gotten there, she didn't look at him the way a supervisor looks at a useful employee. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they've had dinner with in a place that had no tablecloths. Praxis noticed. He didn't say anything because Praxis had the social intelligence of someone who had survived 8 months of being ignored by calibrating carefully to the room, but his silence had a different texture than his previous silence, the texture of someone who has understood something and is being discreet about it. Owen noticed too. Owen noticed everything and said nothing, which was the central pillar of his professional identity and probably the reason Victoria had kept him this long. Harlan Briggs, for his part, had retreated to a watchful distance after the April conference room meeting. The attribution correction had gone through cleanly, fully documented, legally binding, permanent, as Victoria had promised. And the external licensing agreements had been revised with a communication that was factual without being inflammatory, which had apparently satisfied the client relationships Harlan had been protecting, because the complaints he'd predicted had not materialized. Harlan was still on the board. He would probably always be on the board, in the way that certain fixtures are load-bearing even when you'd prefer to remove them. But he had stopped finding reasons to schedule meetings. What remained of the institutional damage was the slower work of rebuilding what had been neglected. Riker understood this kind of work, not the dramatic fix, the all-night remediation, the crisis that announces itself clearly and demands immediate response. This was the other kind. Patient, systematic, the work of going through a house room by room and checking every wall for what had been painted over. It didn't make headlines. It didn't produce a single moment of resolution. It just made things sounder, and the soundness accumulated. By late May, the infrastructure team had grown by 4 people and shrunk by 2, and the net effect was that the system's monitoring was doing what monitoring was supposed to do, catching problems before they became crises, flagging anomalies early enough to address rather than react. Praxis ran the weekly diagnostic reviews with an authority that had developed so naturally that most of the team had stopped noticing it was new. He still occasionally looked surprised when people listened to him, which Riker found both understandable and something he intended to correct gradually. "You keep waiting for someone to tell you to stop," Riker told him one afternoon in early June. Praxis looked up from the monitoring screen. "What?" "In reviews. You present the data and then you wait, like you expect someone to challenge whether you should be presenting at all." Praxis was quiet for a moment. 8 months of documentation updates. "I know, that's the history." Riker set down the report he'd been holding. "But you've been right about every diagnostic call you've made in the last 3 months. At some point, you have to stop waiting for permission to trust your own read." Praxis looked at the screen. "What if I'm wrong?" "Then you'll be wrong, and you'll fix it, and you'll be less wrong next time." Riker pulled up the current diagnostics. "What's your read on node 12? Praxis looked. He didn't hesitate. "The throughput variance is inside normal range, but the pattern is off. It's done that twice in the last 10 days. I'd flag it for review." "So flag it. Just like that." "Just like that," Riker said. Praxis flagged it. 3 days later, a routine inspection found a hardware fault in the Node 12 housing that would have become a real problem inside a month. Owen included it in the weekly infrastructure report to Victoria, and Victoria noted it in the board summary under the heading Early Detection, Prevented Escalation, which was the least dramatic way to describe a significant save, but was also accurate. Some things become what they're supposed to be quietly. That's most things, actually. What? The conversation with Harlan came in the second week of June, and it came to Riker rather than to Victoria, which was itself a kind of statement. Harlan stopped by the 28th floor on a Tuesday morning, which was not his floor and not a time he had any scheduled business there. He came in the way powerful men come into rooms they're claiming temporarily. Head up, pace unhurried, the look of someone doing the place a minor favor by appearing in it. He stood at the edge of Riker's office without coming all the way in, which Riker recognized as a power geometry, the door held open as an implicit option. "Do you have a few minutes?" Harlan said. It was not quite a question. Riker looked at his screen. He saved the file he was working on. He turned his chair. "Sure," he said. Harlan came in then, because the invitation closed the geometry. He didn't sit. Another choice. Keeping the height advantage, which Riker didn't take personally because it wasn't personal. It was reflexive, the way some men carry themselves as a constant negotiation. He looked at the whiteboard, the architecture diagram, the cactus on the windowsill. "You've done good work," Harlan said. "The infrastructure numbers are the best they've been in 4 years, the board has noticed." "The team has done good work," Riker said. Harlan looked at him with the faint tolerance of someone who is used to people deflecting compliments as performance. "You led it." "Yes." No deflection, just the accurate version. Harlan was quiet for a moment, then, "I want to be direct with you." "I appreciate that." "I abstained in February because I believed the situation was being handled too quickly, with too much emotion and not enough deliberation." He said it without apology, which Riker respected despite everything else. "I still believe Daniel Marsh was let go in a way that created liability risk the company didn't need to take on. But," he paused, "the record correction was the right call. I should have voted for it." Riker sat with this. He was aware that this was not a small thing for a man like Harlan to say, and he was also aware that the reason Harlan was saying it to him and not to Victoria was not accidental. "I appreciate you saying that," Riker said. "The reason I'm telling you," Harlan continued, "is that I want you to know where I stand, going forward. You're going to be in this company for a long time, and the board needs to work with you rather than around you." A pause. "And Victoria is going to make decisions that the board needs to trust. That trust is easier when the relationships involved are," he chose the word carefully, "transparent." Riker looked at him directly. "Are you telling me my relationship with Victoria is a conflict of interest?" I'm telling you, I've watched this company for 15 years, and I've seen what happens when the personal and the professional become the same thing with no daylight between them. Harlan's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who had seen a specific kind of wreckage and was issuing a warning in the only vocabulary he had. I'm not suggesting anything improper has happened. I'm suggesting that clarity is good for everyone. I agree with that, Riker said. Harlan waited. Victoria and I are professional colleagues who have also had dinner once in Wicker Park, Riker said. That's the full state of affairs. I intend to continue being professional colleagues. What else develops, if anything does, will not affect how either of us does our job. It hasn't yet, and it won't. He paused. Is that the clarity you're looking for? Harlan studied him for a long moment, the specific study of someone reassessing a person they had categorized too quickly. Then he nodded, once, with the brevity of a man who means what he does and doesn't dress it up. That's the clarity, he said. He left. Riker turned back to his monitor. He sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a conversation that had mattered, and had gone the only way it could go if you'd decided in advance to be honest in it. He thought about what Harlan had said. Clarity is good for everyone. He thought he was right, actually. He'd always found that clarity, even when it was uncomfortable, was better than the alternative. He just found it interesting that the man who had spent February resisting the clearest possible accounting of the company's own records was offering clarity as a virtue. He opened the monitoring report and kept working. He told Victoria about the conversation that afternoon because he didn't see any reason not to. She heard it out with the expression she used when she was working out what she thought before she said it. He came to you, she said. Yes. Not to me. I noticed that too. She was quiet for a moment. They were in his office, the late afternoon light doing its June thing. Longer now, warmer. The city outside the window with the particular quality it had when the season had finally committed. She was at the corner of the room near the window, which was where she often positioned herself in this office. He'd noticed the south light. What did you tell him? She asked. The truth. He looked at her. That we're colleagues who had dinner once, and that whatever else might develop won't affect the work. She was quiet again. He let the quiet be what it was. He's not entirely wrong, she said finally. About transparency. No, Riker agreed. He's not. I have made decisions with full confidence that my judgment is sound. She said it without defensiveness, as a statement of record. It is sound, but I've also... She looked at the window. I've also been aware that I was making them in a context that isn't entirely neutral, and I've been not saying that. I've been not saying some things too, he said. She looked at him. We're not good at the saying part. We're better than we were. He meant it. 3 months ago, she wouldn't have said what she just said to him in an office in full daylight. 3 months ago, he wouldn't have told her about Harlan directly instead of absorbing it and moving on. She looked at the cactus on the windowsill. The baby shoot had put on half an inch since March. It was its own thing now, small but distinct, unmistakably growing. Maisie's going to want to name it, she said. She already has. Victoria looked at him. What did she name it? Spike Jr. Something happened to her face. Quick, unmanaged, the real laugh rather than the polite one. It changed her completely, for the 2 seconds it lasted. He'd seen it maybe 4 times total. Each time he'd thought the same thing, which was that it was the most honest thing about her. That's a good name, she said when she'd recovered. She has strong opinions about names. She has strong opinions about everything. Yes, he said. She does. The room was quiet in the comfortable way, not the loaded quiet of 2 people avoiding something, but the settled quiet of 2 people who had been in enough silences together that they didn't need to fill them. Outside, Chicago in June. Inside, the faint hum of the building's systems running the way they were supposed to run, steady and mostly invisible, the way good infrastructure always was. Riker, she said. He waited. I'm not good at letting things be uncertain, she said. I fix problems, I make decisions, I move. She looked at her hands. The gesture he'd learned meant she was navigating something she hadn't pre-mapped. This is the thing I can't move on by deciding it. No, he said. It isn't. So I'm sitting with uncertain, which is, she looked up, not natural for me. I know. He paused. It's not natural for me either, but I've been sitting with uncertain for a while now, and I'm not worse for it. She looked at him steadily. What are you certain of? He thought about the answer, but not to delay it, but because she deserved the accurate version, not the easy one. That the dinner was the best evening I've had in a long time. That Maisie asked about you 3 times the following week, and not once in a way that had anything to do with the cactus. He paused. That when I'm in a room with you, I'm paying attention in a way I'm not paying attention in other rooms, and that none of that has made me worse at my job. She was very still. I'm also certain, he said, that I'm not in a hurry, and that I'm not asking you for anything right now except to know that it's true. The long pause. She had an expression he hadn't seen before, or rather, he'd seen the components of it separately, the directness, the working something out, the absence of performance. Together, they made something new. Okay, she said. Not the word she used to close a negotiation, the other kind, the one that meant I hear you and I'm here. Okay, he said. It was Owen who told Riker about the industry announcement, because Owen received the trade publication alerts that Riker had not yet set up for himself and forwarded the relevant ones with minimal commentary. The email arrived on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of June, and it said only, "Thought you should see this." Oh, with a link attached. The link went to a piece in a technology industry publication announcing that Daniel Marsh had been appointed Chief Technology Officer of a mid-sized logistics software company in Indianapolis. The article described his background in network security architecture and distributed systems design. It quoted him discussing his vision for enterprise infrastructure. It did not mention Synthera. Riker read it once. Then he closed the browser tab. He thought about what he felt, which was the honest thing to do and not always the comfortable one. What he felt was not nothing. There was a thing, not quite anger, more like the specific exhaustion of watching a pattern continue. The recognition that the world does not always correct for what it gets wrong, that some people walk out of their damage and into a new version of the same arrangement without ever being required to account for the difference. That was real. He sat with it for a moment, let it be what it was. And then he thought about what Daniel Marsh's appointment in Indianapolis had to do with the Node 12 diagnostic praxis had flagged, or the Northern cluster running clean for 4 months, or the architecture documentation that now bore his name in every record where it had been erased, or the dinner in Wicker Park, or Maisie's notebook with the dated cactus drawings, or the way Victoria looked when something surprised her into a real laugh. He thought about how much of his actual life Daniel Marsh occupied, and the answer was approximately none of it. He forwarded the email back to Owen with a single line. Thanks. Northern Cluster report looks good this morning. Owen replied, Agreed. Praxis flagged Node 8 for routine review. Nothing critical. And that was that. This is the thing that took Riker the longest to learn, and that he thinks about sometimes when Maisie asks him questions about fairness, the ones she still asks, because she's 6 now, and the philosophical appetite hasn't diminished. The world does not always deliver the accounting we feel we're owed. Some people get away with things. Some corrections happen on paper and not in the wider story that other people tell. You can be angry about this, and sometimes you should be, and sometimes the anger is the right and honest response to a wrong thing. But at some point you have to decide what you're going to track. You have to decide what you're going to document in your notebook. Because you only have so much attention, and the world will take all of it if you let it. He had spent 3 years being invisible at Synthera, and in those 3 years he had also held his daughter through the death of her mother, and kept her fed and warm and read to and believed in. And he had built something that ran an entire company's infrastructure, and he had kept the record of it in version histories and timestamp logs and the kind of careful documentation that doesn't require witnesses because it is its own witness. None of that had been diminished by the fact that someone else was taking the credit. The work had been real. It had always been real. The credit had just been in the wrong place, and now it was in the right place, and Daniel Marsh in Indianapolis was Daniel Marsh's problem. He opened the diagnostic report and kept working. It was Maisie who moved things forward, which should not have surprised anyone who had been paying attention. She was 6 in October. The summer had been hot and specific in the way Chicago summers are, aggressively alive, Lake Michigan glittering on the weekends when Riker took her to the path along the water, The city committed to warmth with the full enthusiasm of a place that knew it was temporary. Victoria had been to Logan Square twice over the summer, once for a Saturday dinner that had been ostensibly practical. She'd had a document for Riker to review. There had been a conversation about whether to order pizza or cook. Cooking had won. She'd stayed until 10. And once, because Maisie had invited her to the unveiling of a completed drawing she'd been working on for 2 weeks, a portrait of the entire infrastructure department rendered in crayon, which included Praxis depicted slightly taller than he actually was, and Victoria depicted in her wheelchair with what Maisie described as the important expression. "What's the important expression?" Victoria had asked, looking at the drawing. Maisie pointed to the crayon face. "The one you make when something needs to be fixed," she said, with complete seriousness. "It's different from the regular face." "I have a regular face?" "Yes, but you use the important one a lot." Victoria had looked at Riker over Maisie's head. He had looked at the ceiling. The birthday was in October, and Denise came down again, and the party was small. A few kids from Maisie's class, a parent or two who stayed, Denise, Riker, and Victoria, who came at 4 with a wrapped package and the slightly uncertain posture of someone who wanted to be present and wasn't entirely sure of the protocol. Maisie solved the protocol problem immediately by taking her hand. Not asking, not requesting, just taking. The complete confidence of a 6-year-old who had decided the matter and was executing. She pulled Victoria toward the kitchen table where the presents were arranged and said, "You sit here," with the authority of someone who had been planning the seating arrangement for days, which she probably had. Riker watched this from across the room. Denise appeared at his elbow. "She's good," Denise said quietly. "She is," he said, not talking about Maisie. Denise looked at Victoria, who was now being shown the cactus notebook, all the dated drawings, the full record, Spike Jr. documented from first shoot to current height, with the specific kind of attention that said she was genuinely interested and not performing interest. "She actually looks at the drawings." "She looks at everything," Riker said. Denise was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to tell her?" "Tell her what?" "Rye." He looked at his sister. Denise had the expression she'd had on the phone in April, the one that said she already knew what he was going to say and was waiting for him to catch up to himself. "Yeah," he said. "When?" He looked at the kitchen. Maisie was showing Victoria the most recent drawing, pointing out specific details, explaining something with the earnest intensity she brought to things that mattered to her. Victoria was leaning slightly forward, following the point of Maisie's finger, and she looked not like a CEO or a boardroom presence or someone managing the optics of a situation. She looked like a person at a kitchen table in Logan Square on a Saturday afternoon in October, genuinely interested in a 6-year-old's crayon documentation of a cactus. "Soon," he said. Denise patted his arm once, which was her version of a long speech, and went to get more plates. "Yeah," he told her on a Sunday in November, which arrived with the first serious cold of the season, the kind that meant business, the city under a flat gray sky with the specific gravity of a place settling into winter with full commitment. They were in her car. She'd given him a ride home from a team dinner that had run late. One of those informal things, a restaurant in the West Loop, the infrastructure team plus Owen, Praxis ordering carefully from the left side of the menu, and then talking for 45 minutes about fail-safe logic with the animation of someone who had fully forgotten to be careful. It had been a good evening, easy, the way good evenings are easy, the conversation moving without anyone pushing it. In the car, driving north through the city, she had the radio on low, something that wasn't quite jazz and wasn't quite anything else, the kind of station that exists at 11 p.m. in cities that care about music. The streets had that November night quality, the lights amplified by the cold. "Victoria," he said. "Yeah. I've been certain about the things I told you in June." He kept his voice even, not rehearsed, just clear, which was how he tried to say things that mattered. "And I've been sitting with it the way you said you were sitting with uncertain, and I've been not in a hurry, and all of that is still true." A pause. "But I've also been—" He looked at the window, the city going by. "I've been happy. This year. In a way I didn't expect, and a significant amount of that has to do with you." The car was quiet except for the radio and the tires on cold pavement. "I'm not asking you to decide anything," he said. "I'm just done not saying it." She drove for a moment. The light ahead went red, and she stopped, and the car sat in the specific suspension of a red light on a quiet street late at night, and she looked at him. "I know," she said. "I've known since Wicker Park. I know you have." "Then why—" She stopped. She understood why. She was just checking, which was her nature. "The sitting with uncertain," she said. "For both of us," he said. "I didn't want to move faster than—" He thought about how to finish. "Then what's actually true?" She looked at him. Streetlight through the window, the November city, the radio doing its late-night thing. "What's actually true," she said slowly, "is that I have not, in 4 years of running a company and 2 years of figuring out what my life looks like now, I have not felt like this about anything that wasn't work." She said it like it cost something because it did. "That is uncomfortable for me to say." "I know," he said, "and I'm saying it anyway." She looked back at the road. The light had gone green. She drove. So, he said. They didn't kiss. It wasn't that kind of moment. There was no choreography to it, no dramatic apex. She pulled up outside his building, and he sat for a moment, and then he said, "Come up." And she said, "Maisie's asleep." And he said, "I know, come up anyway." And she thought about it for a moment that was not long and said, "Okay." They sat in the kitchen at the small table where he'd sat alone so many evenings in the past few years. And she had tea because he offered, and she said yes, and he had decaf that he didn't particularly want. And they talked until 1 in the morning about nothing specific and everything adjacent to it. The company, Praxis's trajectory, what Maisie had said about the important expression, the Cactus Notebook, a restaurant in Pilsen that Denise had recommended, and neither of them had tried yet. At 1 a.m., she said she needed to go, and he walked her to the door, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at him, and this time he didn't have to say anything, and neither did she. He kissed her. It was quiet and careful, the way things are when you've been paying attention to someone long enough to know what careful means to them. She put her hand on his arm, not pulling him closer, just there, the weight of a hand that had decided where it wanted to be. When she left, he stood in the hallway for a moment in the particular silence of an apartment with a sleeping child and a changed thing. Maisie found out in the way that children find out things that adults have been careful about, by simply being observant and then asking directly, without any of the social lubrication that adults apply to uncomfortable questions. It was a Sunday in December, the three of them at the kitchen table. They'd fallen into this Sunday mornings, not by plan, but by the accumulation of small decisions that add up to a pattern. And Maisie looked up from her cereal and said, "Are you and Victoria together?" Riker looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at her tea. "Yes," Riker said. Maisie absorbed this. She stirred her cereal once. "Like together? Yes?" She thought about it. She looked at Victoria. "Do you like my dad?" "Very much," Victoria said. "He forgets to eat lunch," Maisie said. This appeared to be her primary concern. "I know," Victoria said. "I'm working on it." Maisie nodded, apparently satisfied that the key operational issues had been acknowledged. She went back to her cereal. Then, after a moment, "Can we go to the conservatory today? I want to show Spike Jr. the other cacti." She meant the cactus, now 8 months into its growth, clearly its own plant now, distinct from the parent, both of them thriving on the south-facing windowsill. She had been talking about this expedition for weeks, the idea that Spike Jr. should meet its broader family. "It's December," Riker said. "The conservatory is inside," Maisie said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. He looked at Victoria. She was looking at Maisie with the expression Maisie had drawn, the important one, except softer, the version it became when the thing being observed was not a problem to be fixed. "I'll get my coat," Victoria said. They went to the Lincoln Park Conservatory on a Sunday in December, the three of them, Maisie carrying Spike Jr. in its terracotta pot with the seriousness of an official envoy. The conservatory was warm and green and smelled of earth and wet stone, the specific smell of living things maintained carefully through a Chicago winter. In the desert room, Maisie introduced Spike Jr. to the barrel cactus she'd been visiting since last year. She did this formally, holding the pot up to the glass case and explaining in a narration she'd apparently prepared that Spike Jr. had grown from a baby shoot and was doing very well and lived on a windowsill with good south light on weekends.
Riker stood slightly back, watching this. Victoria was beside him. "She's going to be something," Victoria said. "She already is," he said. Victoria looked at him. He looked at her. Maisie continued the introduction, apparently now explaining the history of the cactus in the building, the office, the carrying home, the baby chute, with the narrative authority of someone who had been documenting this story for a year. "There's a thing that happens sometimes when you've been through enough, when you've carried grief and done the quiet work and shown up for the people who needed you and built things alone in the dark, where the ordinary becomes almost too specific to look at directly. Not beautiful in the elevated way, not cinematic, just true. A warm room in December, a child talking to a cactus. A person beside you who sees you not as what you've achieved or what you've survived, but as the person currently standing in this room with mud on your shoe from the path outside, and a decaf you don't really want and everything else." Riker was not a sentimental person by nature. He was precise, careful, the kind of person who documented things in legal pads and checked his logic twice. But he understood that some things don't require documentation because they're already exactly what they are. Some things you just stand in. By the following spring, Synthera's infrastructure was running at full capacity for the first time in 3 years, with monitoring systems that caught problems before anyone had to work a 48-hour weekend to fix them. Praxis had been promoted twice in 12 months, which was unusual enough that the board had mentioned it, and which Riker had noted was simply what happens when you stop asking competent people to update documentation and let them actually work. The attribution correction was complete. Every patent, every technical document, every external licensing agreement revised to reflect the name of the person who had actually built the thing. Not quietly, not phased, accurately. Harlan Briggs had voted for the second infrastructure expansion in March without abstaining. He didn't mention the June conversation again. Riker didn't either. Some corrections don't require ceremony. Denise came down for Easter with the cheese curds and her kids, and the apartment in Logan Square was loud in the specific way of a family that has more people in it than the square footage was designed for. And Maisie presided over the chaos with a 6-year-old's instinct for authority, assigning roles in some game whose rules she was making up in real time and revising without notice. Victoria sat on the floor, which she did without being asked, because it was the level at which things were happening, and played by Maisie's rules without asking for clarification, which turned out to be the only way to do it. Riker stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his apartment full of people and thought, not dramatically but simply and precisely, that this was different from surviving. He had been surviving for a long time. He knew what it felt like, the daily keeping going, the maintenance of forward motion, the specific pride of staying upright when staying upright was all you could manage. He was grateful for that capacity. It had gotten him here. But this was different. This was the other thing. The thing on the other side of the surviving that you get to if you don't give up and don't give in and keep doing the small necessary things even when the small necessary things are invisible and uncredited and the only person who knows you're doing them is the 5-year-old asleep in the next room. Victoria looked up from the floor and found him in the doorway. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. The room was too loud for it anyway, Denise's kids arguing about something, Maisie adjudicating with the gravity of a small judge. He thought about what he'd tell Maisie someday, when she was old enough for the full story. Not a version cleaned up for the telling, but the actual one. That her father had built something real and had it taken from him, and had not fought back because something more important needed him, and that had been the right call, even when it didn't feel like it. That the work had been real, whether or not anyone knew his name. That the record had been in the code all along, waiting to be read by someone who knew how to read it. That the right person had read it. And that the rest, the cactus, the table, the dinner in Wicker Park, the woman on the floor of their apartment playing a game whose rules kept changing. That was not the reward for the story. That was just what happened when you kept showing up for your own life, even in the years when it didn't seem to be showing up for you. This is what Riker Hale had learned, and what he believed, and what he hoped his daughter would someday understand in her bones rather than just in her head. That invisible work is still work. That a person who does the right thing without an audience is not a lesser version of a person who does it publicly. That grief and love are not opposites. That the strongest thing is sometimes the quietest thing. And that the small green shoot growing at the base of something already established, patient, unhurried, needing only the right light, and someone who remembers to care, will become its own thing eventually.
It will. Outside, spring in Chicago. The lake visible from certain angles, the city lifting its face toward a season it had earned the hard way. Inside, a room full of noise and a man in a doorway with everything he needed in his line of sight. Maisie looked up from the game she was running. "Daddy, come play." "Be right there," he said. He went.